Broken Circle presents Pull the String, a story preeminent fiction podcast. Created and narrated by Stephanie Dailey. Season 1, Unsettling Forecast. Episode 4, Something Was Wrong with the Night. Do you love stories, especially those that are dark, strange, and uncanny? Now this is your personal invitation to come along to where safety is left behind, where so much more is possible, and everything you know might just slowly, stealthily unravel. Do you see that thread dangling in front of you? Yes, that one. Along the border of the life you've woven. Go on. Give it a slight pull. Can you stop the incessant urge once it has taken hold? Would you even try? Now, by your return here, you've shown that a deep inherent love of stories is not completely atrophied, since you once more grasp hold of that loose dangling thread. Yet, at this stage, how could you do otherwise? So, dear friends, settle in, find a quiet corner, and fortify yourself. But be warned, if you pull a string, you might undo the whole thing. From Stories of the Berserker Cafe, entry number 4, dated Monday, August 29th, 2022. Unlike the other stories I've told, I was not directly involved. It was neither a case I was given nor a phenomena I witnessed. Instead, I heard it directly from a witness one night, at the urging of a dear friend and colleague. Even he only knew the bare bones of the story beforehand. By giving us a more complete account, she was hoping it would be received, I assumed, by more open-minded and sympathetic ears. At first, as if by force of habit, I met it with the practiced skepticism I always viewed such claims at the beginning. Both of us had heard our fair share of bogus stories, urban legends, and unrestrained, wild obsessions. As I listened, the sheer force of her description of unhallowed locations, the details she could not have known otherwise, and the conviction with which she told her story made it quickly evanesce away. Hovering out there was also the loss she'd suffered, integrally bound up with the events described. Once more we sat in the Berserker Cafe, facing one another across a small square table, our beverages in hand. Mine was an apple pie latte, something I tried for the first time, and Tim's a cafe americano. My digital recorders were already going. It was a quiet night, and only a few people were now about. I wondered where this journey would take me, and in what unfamiliar place I would be left. After a moment, Tim's rich, clear voice drew me back inside the tale. Besides, given what we did know, she could not have just made up such a story. It simply corresponded with what we had studied, seen, and heard. Besides, her current boyfriend had played a key part and could also provide further testimony. A third person, who could not be present, nor tell his own story, was also involved, but more of that anon. For a moment, Tim paused, his expression distant, lost. As he took several long sips of his coffee, an eerie quiet settled in. Then, abruptly, he went on. As she unfolded this tale, her words were softly spoken. At times they were almost a whisper, her anguish at times very evident. She hadn't been desensitized by one harrowing experience after another as we had been. The sky had been clear, and you could see so many stars. I particularly noticed Orion and the Pleiades, she said. When I heard her make reference to that constellation, I shuddered. She paused. Are you okay? I nodded. We had stayed late at a friend's house playing games, eating our fill of fish and baked potatoes, and then had a sweet French dessert, creme brulee. It was the first time I'd tried it, and as we drove along the taste still lingered in my mouth. Ardell, my husband, hadn't liked it as well, but he wasn't as enthusiastic about desserts as I was. Her tone encompassed all the cheerful qualities of someone recalling a treasured moment. Then it abruptly went flat. Evelyn paused, cleared her throat, but her voice did not change. Ardell and I had been married for just about a year. Two of Ardell's and Caleb's college friends had invited us. Caleb Oliver was my husband's ex-roommate and best friend. He sat in the back, slouched down in that peculiar way of his, while we chatted about the evening and the food, the weather, the books we were currently reading, our normal, everyday conversation. With the headlights' twin blades still piercing deep into the night, we drove along. There were no issues, no changes. You see, we were heading north on Cleveland-Massillon, leaving Norton, going into the southern edge of Hurley Township. After that night I studied the maps of that small area intensely, yet never found one damn clue. As we went by the Loyal Oak Winery on our right, I could just barely make out the sleeping vineyard. We now descended sharply, with the street cutting deeply into the hill. On the right, Summit Road came down meeting us. Cleveland-Massillon kept on its descent here, curving slightly until it straightened before reaching the low bridge traversing the Barberton Reservoir. When we were nearly across, we could see the water was smooth as polished silver. Clouds floated in, blocking the waning crescent moon. As soon as we cleared the bridge, the way ahead ascended upward in another slight curve for a short distance, then straightened up. Not until we crossed the bridge was there any difference. In the blink of an eye, the texture of everything around us changed. I couldn't help but immediately sense a static charge in the air. Something inexplicable was now wrong with the night itself. Just then you could hear a low whistle, feel the slight resistance as heavier air brushed up against the car. At first it did not amount to much, but as it slowly intensified, our speed decreased. Not very far on my left ahead I could see a rusted barn just past where Summit Road crosses Cleveland-Massillon, decrepit and only one story, a shimmering silvery blue light creeping toward aqua emanated from inside. The first thing my husband pointed out was a single street light above the intersection. Instead of the usual bright white, it was a sallow pea color. It then went out and flickered back on as a vibrant azure, then a sickly shade of lime. The last combined all three. The bulb's glow was blurry and stretched, as if seen through either tears or rain. Here I first really noted how much the palette of the landscape, the buildings, the sky itself had altered. An inexplicable illumination now fell over everything. Yet inside our car, you see, it did not shift in any way. Nearer us, the shadows were of vibratory coal. Farther away, they were a sheer vermilion or purple. The rules there were never consistent. Whatever ones it played by remain a mystery. A few moments later we passed a cluster of odd-looking structures exuding a white-blue light as if they were encased in some deep Arctic ice. Those buildings were not huge at all, just clustered close together. I was reminded, I don't know why, of an enormous hive. Although it was only late October, we sensed a steep drop in temperature. A sudden dread crept over us that this cold might seep in. However, some barrier we can't explain must have kept it out. Not until later on, when the door seals were broken, did I really feel any of it. Something large lit up the night, moving crossways in the sky and skirting the edge of the clouds. I caught sight of an enormous set of columns set further back behind this hive cluster. Fortunately, the headlights still carved a way through this strange, vivid glow, but their range was short. Should they have failed, I am not sure there would have been any me left who could tell this. Although many questions ached for release, we were all silent. It was finally Caleb who broke this lethargic quiet. What is going on? Did we get on a different road? Why does the night look so weird? He seemed on the verge of panic. I did not blame him. Ardell spoke up, his eyes shifting from the road, staring at me for a moment. I don't think this is a different road. We aren't anywhere near there. We're somewhere else. If we got into this, we can get back out. His words carried a calm authority. I always treasure the memory of him from that moment. As all of the colors outside mutated, their peculiar taint grew worse. Even the numerous shades of gray were all unseemly. Each resembled some malignant mold, slowly growing over anything it could touch. The few lamps and lanterns dotting the houses, barns, and miscellaneous structures emitted a color between evergreen, grapefruit, and mustard, blending them into a surreal shade, which was a torment for our eyes. Tim's own eyes had been distant as he was telling this. Now he turned back, focused, alert. Jonah, there is one connection you should know. I had not yet seen those comic books I was searching for, but the colors inside each panel reminded me of her description. She had paused, gathering herself, then continued. I saw something very deep down was wrong with the night itself. Nothing on earth should look that way, neither the day, nor twilight, nor midnight. I glanced upward and saw that where the clouds were gone, it seemed more a dome riddled with holes. Out of each one peeked an iris. There was the iridescent slick of spilled motor oil. I thought, sick minds, perhaps infinitely depraved, must lie behind those eyes. Where such an impression came from, I am not sure. I wonder, was the place starting to get hold of my mind? I believe I was fine afterward, but who could really know? The seed of a fear, something is always following me close behind, was planted then. I try and shake it, but after what happened to poor, she trailed off for a few moments. I did try and reassure her that there were methods that would end any possible influence. As Tim had interjected that comment, I had gotten a glimpse of something. An echo of an echo told not by my uncle, but by someone else. It lasted a moment, then evanesced away. After an intense sigh, she went on. I think we kept hoping it would end quickly. We were all silent and watchful, lost in a haze of dread and nausea. On the right we saw only empty ground. After that we dreamily passed fields of dry and stalky plants, standing in unvarying rows. On the end of their stems were ragged bulbs. An ice-blue substance had made its way upward on the stalk, emerging as a turquoise when it reached the frond-wreathed bulbs. Now animated by the ubiquitous breeze, pressing in on and goading everything around, they seemed like large spiders hoisted up on those stalks, performing some eerie, indecipherable dance at the direction of the heavy wind. I could not help but imagine that those movements would unhinge any mind unfortunate enough to grasp their real meaning. The impression was thrust upon us that the profane matters we were witnessing were part of some ritual drama, and it would not willingly let us go. By this time my husband was having a harder time keeping the wheel steady in that syrupy atmosphere. Yet we kept on driving even as the pressure increased. The light on the dashboard now flickered as if something was wheedling its way in. When there was an attempt to fiddle with the windows, the mechanisms in the door armrest wheezed. The same interference must have kept it at bay. Was something preserved inside the car an outside force could not reach, but only pressed on at the edges? There are so many questions. What if I could know? Would it be good, or do some terrible thing to my mind? She steadied me for a moment. Do you understand any of this? I nodded slowly. Portions of it. We know only in part, I responded. Many of these incidents betray a harsh truth. Our universe is riddled with these places, even here on our Earth. All I can say is that it reshuffled the normative order inside this shard skirting our reality, waiting for an opportune moment it could rush in. I shook my head. I am probably not helping very well. Look, certain places are more prone to these phase shifts than others. It was one of many wounds left in the universe from long ago, probably made worse by certain ceremonies, consciously or unconsciously performed, without understanding the consequences. It had nothing to do with any of you, I stated. She now stared at me. I think I begin to understand a little. We fell into a hole in reality that somehow twisted back around again. I laughed for a moment. Not bad, I replied. So we tried going on, she continued. The counter pressure got worse, and the speedometer showed us decelerating. There wasn't a single street sign, posted speed limit, a single place of real business now. Just once in a while, another eerie structure, which might have been a house or a barn, but none resembling any designs we'd ever seen. I finally told Caleb and Ardell my impression of them, that a piercing loneliness emanated from each one. If a style of architecture, I said, can look damned, these certainly do. Here I'd finally broken the lurking silence. My husband nodded. No piece of architecture, no matter how kitsch or postmodern, had ever made him feel so repulsed, so unsettled. Caleb chimed in. Have you noticed? Nothing I've ever seen or studied has tried imprinting itself on my mind with such ferocity. There is a perverse, hungry ugliness in every corner opening and indentation. Now here my voice intruded in, as if it is all reaching out, thrusting itself at us. Is that how you both see it? Both spoke up at the same time. Yes. It reminds me, I began, but cut myself short. I had already been speaking softly, lest my words were heard by any outside. The nearest thing the two agreed on was that they resembled certain National Socialist or Soviet buildings that had been built with the intention of withering the dignity of a human soul. Both were certain that the structures did not possess a single cubic centimeter fit for mankind. The undercurrent of deep dread we still had was centered on the knowledge we were somewhere off the maps, and yet we kept moving along, slowed by atmospheric resistance, attempted manipulation, and irrepressible dread. Street lamps had now popped up every so many feet, burning with the same distorted colors. Here, as the night shifted once again, the uncanny light came from everywhere, intensified, and was as if the murky velvet faded away so that you could see all the bland buildings, airy fields, and shrunken trees. Simultaneously, every object remained muted and swallowed. There was a subtle blurring whose force dragged our eyes in alien directions. There was a subtle blurring whose force dragged our eyes in alien directions, but which also now ached with a paradoxical clarity. No one who hasn't experienced it could imagine just how off everything was. I wondered, did the forceful illumination serve the purpose that anyone confronted by this place must face it all without mercy or reprieve? Hearing her inferences at this point, I could not help but think what an agent she would have made. Now another subtle urge rattled with our minds. We were being nudged toward becoming denizens of this place. If we accepted, it was understood, we would no longer remain human. The offer was extended only as a courtesy. I felt only total revulsion at the idea. When I looked over at my husband, and then at Caleb, I could see that they felt the same. In the next moment, while the car engine sputtered, we were sliding on some oily substance. We skidded a short distance, but then my husband got it under control. The vehicle spun halfway around, so that we now faced toward the field that had been on our left. As we sat there stunned, the invitation continued, never abating while we remained. The street lamp beside us, on the left side of the car, was white and icy. There was something about that pole that made me feel uneasy. The surface looked leathery or even scaly. It made me think of one of those deep-sea creatures that can generate its own light. A little past it, on the weedy side of the road, there was a sidewalk, and beyond this, in what appeared was a small parking lot, an old London phone booth, the kind you generally don't see anymore. At this point, my husband kept turning the key, but the starter wouldn't work. The solitary phone was looking better as the one familiar object in this sea of dreck. I couldn't help but think of those fishing lures dangling in the water. Who knew in this place? Maybe the whole place was one huge lure. She shook her head in that tight, quick way you do when suppressing a thought. Here Tim paused, getting a sip of his café American. He swallowed with a rough, hard sound. When all this had been reported, I was far away on another investigation, and nowhere near one of our extensions. There were more and more uncanny surprises like this awaiting all of us before 1999. There was something doubly recognizable here, both in the speech and behavior patterns of the woman and his other off-the-cuff references. Some shadowy familiarity reverberated through me every time he mentioned 1999. If only I could grasp hold of those half-memories. I'm not ready to speculate on either, for now they are best left private. After a short pause, she went on. We sat there in a slow, intensifying panic. Just where were we? What had happened to us? The car still only made a slight whining squeal, as if it might start, but couldn't quite connect. At this point, Caleb spoke up. Look, I can get out, make a run for the phone booth. If we are even near the edges, I might reach someone. I vigorously shook my head no. Or make contact with something we shouldn't, Caleb. They are it. Gods or devils might not be quite aware we are here. If we can get this started, I gestured at the key in the ignition. We may have a chance. I paused. Just then the aching brightness shifted into a sickly yellow, glowing through a fog that spiraled and twisted at a wide arc around us. I noticed something in the periphery of my view that I was sure hadn't been there before. She paused, then gave us both a steady, searching look. You know how there are some people you wished you'd never met? Some things you wish you'd never seen? Well, what I saw then was so much more. My husband and Caleb saw them a moment after. Now we had been observed, and even more, we were now being studied. She shifted her focus over to my friend. All right, dear brother, do you remember how you asked me when I first approached you if we'd seen any inhabitants? But I couldn't give you a very good answer. You see, there were those impressions, pushing steadily at us. But not until that moment did we see anything in the open. Up on the surrounding hills were silhouettes of figures wearing wide-brimmed hats, each one standing about 100 feet from the other. Their heads were bent down towards us in continuous, unceasing attention. Outside, the cavorting fog began abating, and the grating texture eased. We soon noticed what stood at a medium distance, motionless like ever-vigilant soldiers observing potential troublemakers. These others looked like they were made from fuzzy, reverberating straw. They had deep, rough eyes filled with velvet shadows. All of them remained still. I think we were a surprise. I cannot coherently account for this. If they were monsters or dark creatures, why would we be such an enigma, or a paralyzing danger? They also only watched on and on. At this point, Caleb was fumbling with his left pocket. Triumphantly, he pulled out a quarter and went to crack open the door. His fumbling had gotten my husband's attention. He gave Caleb a stern reminder about his asthma. You shouldn't risk going outside in that damp. I should go. I decided we'd come this way. He reached for the door. I pleaded. Neither of you go. Wait a moment, I said. You don't even know if either of you could breathe out there. Again, Caleb reached for the handle. He peered craftily at us. I'd had enough of it all. Don't go, Caleb. He began another protest. Stop being such a halera, I snapped. His hand eased its hold on the door handle. Ardell cut in. Oh, for goodness sake, enough debate. We have to do something. He turned toward the door, actually pulled on the handle. Wait! My plea came out as a strangled whisper. For a moment I held on. I'll just run for the booth and get help, he said. I was breathing heavily. Remain calm, I thought. We don't know what those beings might want or how they'll act. The door was ajar now. Ardell squeezed around the slim opening. The air that crept in had a terrible arctic chill, and was strange, sour, and thick, but was cut off as the door snapped shut. When he attempted a sprint across the speckled road, his advance was sluggish, caught in the same viscous atmosphere that had resisted our car. He sidestepped the small but deep potholes and fractures that had opened up. At this point, she began trembling. You see, I can't quite get past what happened next. Again, my mind was alerted to something after this. It came closer for a moment, then retreated, as Tim went on with her story. As he finally got over the splintering road and cut past the sidewalk, through the grass toward the phone booth, I glanced back at the observers. None of them had moved. The one group, those above, were silent and still. No gestures signaled the straw men, who stood in silent, unmoving vigil, that my husband should be corralled. Perhaps they were different groups or even afraid of each other. Whatever the reason, you can be sure they weren't just larking about. Tim straightened up his chair. I almost opened my mouth, but Evelyn gave me such a look that I did not dare. My curiosity had been further piqued, for I had heard of those above before. Tim leaned back, stroking his chin. As you will learn, there are certain matters it is usually cruel to reveal. This was one. Laura, did I say? I meant Evelyn, took a deep breath, her eyes wandering from the campfire over to the backyard tree line. My husband now approached the phone booth and reached down in his left pocket. I don't think men ever keep change in a right, do they? Maybe it is an affectation or just easier. I'm not sure. She smiled, but it just as quickly faded. Even as Tim went on telling this, I realized there was something concrete about this Evelyn, her manner of speech, certain expressions at key points, elusive, funny, and sad, then deeply profound, that felt so familiar. Who was she? Could she be? Why his slip-up? Why use that particular name and then correct himself? For a moment he reached to open the booth. Then his feet slid on something. Ardell twisted about, almost losing his balance. The quarter sailed out of his hand. It twinkled in reflected light and then must have fallen. He bent down looking for it. I quickly glanced backward. None of the creatures had moved. Perhaps they had just witnessed this all before. A repeated farce that must be watched, but whose outcome they met with somber indifference. There was a window in the front of the small, oblong building behind the phone booth. I could have sworn the booth had been nearer the sidewalk when we first saw it. I saw him glance over at the window, look down, jerk his head back up. After a moment, he tilted his head, as if he did not comprehend what he had seen, then resumed probing for the lost quarter. After this, he went under the lamp projecting from the building. Moving on, head down, he closed in on the alley, disappearing in partial shadow. I lost sight of him. Her breathing quickened. Caleb kept a close lookout as well, but there was nothing we could do. The seconds went by in slow agony. Not long after, Ardell came scurrying back, impeded by the same slippery material. At this point, Caleb must have seen the nausea and agitation on his face, and he was out of the car. Almost immediately, he began gagging and coughing. My husband gained the road, weaving carefully around the holes and rifts. Just then a movement caught Caleb's attention. The street lamp had shifted. Out of it came a series of bellows. I would rather stab my ears than hear those again. Half scream and half booming reverberation, followed by hissing and static, sounding at times like words shrieked at eternal night. Even with my senses reeling, I caught sight of long, thin wires reaching downward, as Caleb stood frozen. I cried out from inside the car. Just then my husband came by, diving hard into the back seat. His motion must have broken the spell, for within moments Caleb had scrambled inside, slamming the door hard. The street lamp briefly hunched down, peered in, and whirled away. The thing's movements were shaky, almost drunken. My husband shouted at me, "Drive! Drive!" He shoved the keys at me. I hadn't realized he'd taken them with him. Was some voice reaching out and influencing our decisions? Or had he been so muddled by our circumstances that he didn't think? It was one of several choices from that gray night that still baffled me. As I slid over to the driver's seat, I fearfully glanced back. The cornstalk men had moved ever so slightly. You see, fearing they might have made a decision about us, I nearly jammed the key in too hard. Still, I managed to get it in fully and then sent a prayer the length of a sigh. If God's good world was meant as a place of order and coherence, please let that come back here. Slowly, almost timidly, I turned the key. Nothing. I turned it again. Her expression held so many different emotions. I guessed that she saw it all again. The engine sputtered on. We leapt forward, gliding across those cracks and gouges. The view in front of me flowed with a molasses thickness, and then the hollow luminescence sputtered out. By the time my panic subsided, the street lights were no longer that sour color, and around us the night looked fresh and cool. Caleb spoke, breaking my feeling of triumph. "What did you see through the window and in the alley between the buildings?" he asked my husband. When I glanced back in the rearview mirror, I might have mistaken him for a lifeless mannequin if he hadn't turned his head toward the window. It was more perverse than I can explain what I saw. At this point I heard the snap of a seatbelt lock. A ritual? An unholy shared meal? Besides, there's no way I could ever express it accurately. I could only tell you a dim, murky version, but both of you would try imagining it. An exercise I don't recommend. You'll never hear any details from me, no, not ever, if I would remain a true husband and friend. For days, even weeks, we still tried. Caleb and I thought that unburdening himself might help. The experience was not suited for weak human eyes or ears. His whole face glazed over. Even the scents were perverse, and the odors underneath were strata upon strata of decay. In his nightmares he would mutter, "How can they be so moldable, reshape themselves, break apart, merge?" And what they chanted, the psalms of the deep void, making them melt and flow at the last. How? 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 I would wake him when I could stand it no more. His eyes would glow with an anger he didn't even understand. Within a few days I bought earplugs. They were not enough. So I would drift out and sleep on our couch. During the day all seemed well, until he discovered his pen was missing. When more time had finally passed and he'd calmed down, he mentioned his pen again. I was sure I had it earlier. What did I do with it? At least I have the newer one. He even smiled at that point. A light came on inside me. Here was a little more of the man I'd fallen in love with. "What was the last time you saw it?" I asked, casually. I should have let the matter drop. His eyes changed abruptly. He shuddered with an odd, twisted tension I have never seen in a human being before or since. "I must have dropped it on that night, in that place. Oh, God!" His eyes widened in the same shock I had seen when he first got in the car. "Don't you understand? They might use it, and maybe trace, even find our position in this boiling, turbulent multiverse." He stared at me as if I were a clueless child. "Maybe I've let them out." "Oh, you don't understand." He held his head, swaying. "Don't be ridiculous." At that moment I moved toward him. "Can't you see, Evelyn? If they have it, they can trace the patterns." He shook his head. "Don't ask me how I know this. Those things inside, they are not just vile and bent, survivors from some failed existence. They are necromancers, dark artists of a superior and nuanced kind. I think we leave a stamp on anyone or anything we are associated with, and they can extract that information. And once they've done that, it'll be a cascade, and they'll see and use me to find their way here, perhaps wiping away anyone who'll sound the alarm." He began pacing about, agitated. "How did we get there anyway? Was it by design? Whose design? What will happen if they do come? I must be so careful now." I kept reassuring him, but it was as if he'd lost sight of me. When Caleb, the only other person who could understand, came over, neither of us could persuade my husband. Believing he must keep an ongoing vigil, Ardell refused to sleep. By late afternoon of the next day, his eyes shut and he was out quickly. Shortly thereafter, Ardell began talking in his sleep again. Caleb leaned over after a few seconds. He pulled away with a look of disgust. It's as if something is pulling on his memories so that he's reliving it with greater clarity. Shaking his head, he turned to leave the room, but not before my husband's eyes flew open. He leapt up and struck out at Caleb before either of us could react. Fortunately, in his exhausted state, it amounted to nothing more than a light punch. Without waiting, Caleb gripped him and pushed him down onto our bed, where he thrashed about. When his strength failed, his eyes glazed over, and he was soon far away in some secret nightmare. Over the next few days, Ardell ate less and less. He would sneak off by himself, his head tilted peculiarly, listening and obsessively sniffing the air. I heard him mutter that he must make sure the path in was gone. Pretty soon it became evident he was also neglecting his job. Then on the third week after, they found he had replaced the door lock with one of his own. When forced to break it down, they found that the neglected project files had been hurled into a corner. Hundreds of pages of notes discussing what had happened, debates with himself, and proposed solutions were strewn over his desk. The corkboard beside his desk was filled up as well. Distressed at this behavior, they had called me. When I arrived, they were still at a loss. I called Caleb at his job at a different architectural firm. Claiming a family emergency, he left. Fortunately, I persuaded them to turn those papers over to us. On the wall was a huge map of the Summit County area, cryptically coded notes scrawled in very discreet and tiny handwriting, and several drawings of the buildings he'd observed. I stifled a cry as I saw those images in black and white. I think I have located the point where the 2nd and 9th shrines were visible, he had written. If I return and there is no sign, not even their sigils, the portals must have irised, and the link was too weak and is now broken, and we are safe. And another, but I still feel those eyes on me whose gaze must have slipped from their ritual but a moment, and perceive me there. I still cannot repeat those phrases nor think of those images easily. No one else would have known where he'd go, just us. Ardell would be headed back into Ohio, into Summit County, back to Harthley. I shivered now. It was suddenly so cold in his office. I have to try and find him. As afraid as I was, I agreed. My trembling voice was as firm as I could make it. He looked at me sternly. We don't know if he can find a way back inside. Words failed him. Caleb frowned. I could read his doubts about my going on his face. Protesting, I told him Ardell was my husband, a bond greater than that of a best friend. I won't risk losing both of you. If I go, I'll only risk losing myself, no one else. Yet he knew he could do nothing to stop me. We left Tarrytown, crossed the Hudson at the nearest bridge, early the next morning. I didn't even want to think about where we might really end up. When we arrived, several trips along the same route we'd taken on Cleveland-Massillon, day or night, yielded nothing, for it seemed the hollowed-out place was gone. The weeks stretched on toward winter, and we went about everything seeking any sign. I began fearing the worst. Not his death, mind you, but that other possibility. One day a visit occurred from 2 police officers who came to my hotel room. Ardell had been found indeed, propped up against the inside of a crumbling, long-neglected rock wall. The official verdict would be he died from exposure in the week prior, when the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The odd thing, the coroner noted that it appeared as if he had been pushing backward into the wall. I can only guess that he acted on his belief that if he perished, then the link would be broken. I tried holding on, had tried calming him in my arms, but he pulled away, goaded into this solution while caught in a net that neither of us could have countered. Only Caleb has remained with me. My partner at the corporation gave his younger sister a melancholy smile, then a quick hug. She only made one final comment. This is virtually the only abnormal experience I've seen in my life. Fortunately, that is the way it is for most people. One and done, I responded. At least for you it is over. Evelyn nodded. And you? She looked directly at me. I felt irrevocably alone. I shook my head adamantly. For me? Probably never. I'm in far deeper than you can imagine. Both of us ended that evening wishing we could also be told the same thing. One and done. It felt like the most glorious phrase imaginable. No more encounters, no more learning about the depths of vexing realities. Although her soul-numbing loss was great, we could have told her of far worse things seen and heard, but we knew we couldn't without pulling her and her boyfriend in. All at once my heartbeat sped up dangerously. But isn't that what you are doing now, here, by telling me these stories? I thought. Perhaps his friend Golightly had been trying to tell me something. Tim went on. Now, it appears the events from that night had inadvertently disclosed too many secrets and forbidden matters. Consequently, those above, who were aligned with the silent ones inside, had fixed their ever-wakeful eyes upon both our narrator and her friends. All they both desired was that the events be hushed up and never probed into, much less have their strange significance understood. Those sleepless ones had already taken harsh steps that cost a life. Despite this implied threat, our storyteller still related her story with courage, mastery, and finesse. You see, at this stage we did not have all the insights we gained later, and it contributed much. Understand this: we have our own techniques that would stand firm against any additional threats. It's all I can say about it now. Had we not been distracted by other matters, mostly going on further north in Summit County, we would have discovered the truth earlier about the ongoing changes occurring on that road. We now put greater focus there, collecting rumors, complaints, and from many eyewitnesses. In one way, the unique details we uncovered came as a surprise, and in another way, not. Almost every description of the meta-actuality mold was different. After reading the reports and collating all of them, I can only conclude so much has changed since the events of '99 that fragments from possible worlds were temporarily drawn in and enmeshed there. As usual, this report sparked an interest in accounting for all these oddities and generated in their turn new problems, but that is for another day. For several minutes all was quiet. As I went to switch off the recorder, he smiled at me, then broke the silence. Quite a terrible story, I know, but I was only the messenger. As a messenger of what, I wondered. Leaning back, he smiled kindly, studied me for a moment. Another tale where you'll have time for some reflection, although I can't help but wonder if it wasn't perhaps more personal this time. He got up, threw his cup away. He waved goodbye. As Tim nodded in farewell, his face grew very serious. When he left me, I was still glued in my chair, meditating on the bizarre set of coincidences I'd just heard. The names were different, but were they the same people? Was this a lost part of my family's saga? Uncle Isaac was a full partner at my father's architectural firm in Cleveland, and Aunt Laura was someone whose wisdom and humor I had always treasured. Her first husband had indeed died in strange circumstances, but the details were kept vague. I doubt that she had ever shared much with either my mother, for it would have smacked too much of something bizarre, or my father, who might have considered it, given the sources, but he kept his own quiet counsel. As for Aunt Laura, could I be sure? Could I ever broach the subject with her? Regardless, she would ask adamantly, with every right, for I had heard all of the details. I couldn't risk being worn down in that way. I had secrets of my own now I'd promised to protect. Yet the question lingered. What other secrets had been kept from me by my family? I now asked out loud to myself. I felt my stomach clench. There would be more than one difficult question I would eventually be forced to ask. I only wished I could reach out to my uncle, but that was not possible. If he had been the other employee in the story as was implied, then he had known Zohar indeed. But how had that all ended? Did Zohar already know the connection between us? Did he wait on me for the first move? Why hesitate? Was this some complex game I had been long unaware of? I needed more before I could trust him fully, for now I could afford to listen. Only just listen. Now I had imagined these narratives were only tantalizing glimpses of impossible events, just a few pulls on that preternatural thread, but kept at arm's length. Now it has grown unexpectedly more muddled. I remembered my grandmother's words. When the thread was pulled even once, it could keep on unraveling. Just how quickly I hadn't considered. After tonight, I cannot wonder if her seemingly light-hearted warning didn't carry a deeper meaning. I had suspected these stories related to my uncle's mysterious profession, but they might be more personal than I'd ever conceived. Yet I took this bait willingly, and I have no choice but going wherever it may take me, no matter how far from home. And so, dear friends, you can see the mysteries and enigmas presented here have deepened a little more. Yet I will continue here alongside you, on this journey, a voice in the dark, a companion in this night. Didn't I promise? For we have only just begun pulling at that loosened weave and unthreading the fabric of, well, everything. If you pull a string, but you've already been warned, haven't you? Even so, faithful listeners, you've kept on, eager to see where all this will go. This has been a Story Preeminent Fiction podcast, presented by Broken Circle, Pull a String. Created, conducted, and narrated by Stephen L. Dailey. Photographed by Stephanie Dailey. Music courtesy of Scott Buckley. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Next episode, Fragments.